I now get to talk about a slight bright spot in this whole process, about sort of serious attempts to resolve the issue and sort of questions about practical steps and how we go about resolving this question. And to do that, we're going to talk about Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which collected data between 2008 and 2015. And it was an aspect of the federal government's Indian residential school settlement. Um, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is supposed to do, because it is a justice procedure, but it is not about punishment. The intention, this is a judicial procedure that was developed to deal with sort of the Rwandan genocide and with apartheid. And the reason that there was sort of a desire to have a somewhat different procedure to deal with that was that these were sort of atrocities that were connected to so many people in like a community and in a national and like on a country level, that it started to get impossible to talk about punishing people. So if you talk about apartheid South Africa and the division between white South Africans and black South Africans, it's not reasonable to talk about punishing white South Africans for benefiting from an apartheid system. They did benefit from an apartheid system, but it doesn't make sense to talk about punishing them, because aside from anything else, sort of saying, well, we're going to punish all white people doesn't make sense. And it's also really difficult to prove, for example, that you benefited from the oppression of black people in South Africa when you never met them. So when we're starting to talk about huge societal issues, the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission becomes quite useful. And that is sort of based on an idea that in order to heal a society, okay, what you need to do is not necessarily to punish all of the guilty parties, to punish everyone who had some small amount of things to do with this sort of massive problem in your society. That's not to say that you can't do it. It's not that a TRC, for example, does not prevent you from being like, oh, well, you didn't just benefit from, for example, apartheid South Africa. You led raiding parties and raped 55 like black members of your black neighbors. We're still putting you in prison. You can do that and run a TRC sort of alongside that. And the TRC, the idea here is that the important thing to fix a society is actually not about punishing every individual person who might have been involved. So, for example, when we talk about Indian residential schools, the goal is not necessarily to punish every single teacher, every single administrator, all of that. That's not the goal. Instead, the goal is to deal with the things that are in the name. First of all, to document and understand what the truth of that experience is. Okay, so to talk about, in Canada's case, right, this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada was about Indian residential schools, so was to document people's experiences of residential schools and to talk about that in a way that took their statements as true, even when they were expressed in ways, for example, that would not hold up to like a criminal cross-examination. So, for example, in Canada's TRC, they collected oral traditions, right? They collected people who sat there and said, this is what my grandmother told me about her experiences in residential schools. And that isn't really admissible as evidence in sort of a court of law, but it can be part of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Or, for example, you would have people who came in and said, my father lived in residential schools in this period of time, and this is how that affected our family. This is what he was like as a father afterwards. And there wasn't sort of a need to establish like a cause and effect where it's like, well, can you prove that that's not really because your father had existing psychological problems, and like the goal wasn't to prove necessarily that, but to sort of collect those experiences and get that piece. And then the second half is about reconciliation, which is more power to them. The commissioners on this one had an incredible task because they were asked to come up with the answer to what would it take to fix this relationship? What would it take to fix the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians? So when we talk about the TRC in Canada, there's a couple of pieces that we need to understand. First of all, its scope is somewhat limited. As much as sort of, what does it take to fix this relationship seems like an enormous question, the TRC was only dealing with the harm caused by residential schools. So they're not touching treaty violations. They're not touching systemic and endemic poverty. They're not touching discrimination experienced by Indigenous peoples. They're not touching sort of attempts to eliminate cultural practices in terms of banning potlatches and sundances. They're not touching any of that. All the TRC is concerned with is the residential school system. Okay? And it still took them 7 years to get through and collect all of their data and come up with their recommendations. So they did their data collection. The commissioners went and traveled across the country to any number of Indigenous communities, like all over the place, collecting testimony from people. And this is all recorded. So if you want to listen to it, you can listen to audio recordings of residential school survivors tell you what happened to them, what happened to their parents, all of those sorts of pieces. And the formats of that can be quite varied. So they include sort of some oral storytelling where people are just sort of telling their stories, but it also includes art projects and sort of musical recordings and all kinds of other expressions of that as sort of part of that. Okay, so they spent a long time collecting those experiences and going from community to community and sort of booking time for people to speak and asking people what their experiences were and sort of reaching into communities and finding translators for people who only spoke Indigenous languages and to sort of try to collect that data. As I said, that is available in an archive and you can take a look at some of it. You can listen to some of it online if you are thusly inclined. I will just warn you, some of it can be pretty heavy. The second sort of question about what would it take to fix this relationship, the answer so far seems to be quite a lot. So the entire TRC report is very long. You are welcome to read it. It is available on the government website, so you can pick it up if you are thusly inclined. But if you're not going to do that, I would recommend that you take a look, even briefly, at the TRC's calls to action, which are sort of the, not so much the like broad philosophical statement about what's wrong with this relationship, but here are the steps we need to fix this problem. Okay? And there are 20 pages of them. So I don't, you can take a look at the specifics to get a look at that, but I want you guys to understand that in 7 years they came up with 20 pages of things that need to be done in order to fix this relationship. And some of those are pretty easy, and some of those are really, really not. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of them. This is not necessarily all of them. We don't have time for that. You can definitely take a look at them all. But there are a couple of things that we should sort of talk about there. So for example, these are all about reconciliation. So there's some big broad things like adopting the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework. So signing on to the treaty about the United Nations Declaration about the rights of Indigenous people is sort of an important potential step to that. Also some things that seem very basic that still haven't been done. So for example, one of the TRC's calls to action was, can we please document the number of Indigenous children in foster care? And when I talked about that in one of our more recent videos, or one of our videos prior, I said that about 50% of the foster care population is Indigenous, but we don't know exactly because there's no aggregation of those data. There's no sort of standard criteria that says, yeah, we want to know if this child is Indigenous, whether both of their parents have status or not. like different provinces record that information differently, they make it available publicly differently, they count who is Indigenous in different ways, as in, for example, if you are status Indigenous, you're status Indian, but you don't identify as belonging to your community, are you status, or like, are you Indigenous or not in our data? So there's a lot of stuff we still don't know about, for example, the number of Indigenous children in care, the number of Indigenous children who are experiencing juvenile detention, all of those sorts of pieces. Okay, some of those TRC recommendations are things like training public servants in Indigenous issues. So training public servants in how Indigenous people respond, like how Indigenous cultures in the area where they work respond to things like zoning requirements, so that people have an understanding of the people that they're working with and working for. Um, Another sort of one that we sort of incorporated into this class in particular is adjusting school curriculums. So one of the TRC's recommendations was basically we should talk about residential schools in classrooms. Canadian students should learn about these things. And it's really easy for me to do in a lot of ways because I teach university students, but that recommendation is actually about putting it in all school curriculums. So if you've sort of been following the relatively recent discussion about the new social studies curriculum, one of the reasons that the idea of residential schools was included in the Alberta curriculum from K through 12 was a recommendation from the TRC, was taking up that call to action and sort of saying, like, yeah, we got to do this thing. So they started working with teachers about how do we talk about residential schools to first graders, and that kind of conversation. So some of them are really simple that way. But like in a lot of ways, the actions are much simpler to sort of list than to actually take. Also included in this sort of thing is things like fixing inequities in health sort of outcomes and mental health outcomes and that kind of thing. So those 20 pages are available. It's, I will say, a pretty interesting read in that it gives you, first of all, a place to start if you're looking to sort of move that idea of reconciliation forward, but also sort of some scope about just how many things the idea is that they need to change. And the goal overall is to sort of remake the relationships between Indigenous people, the Canadian population, and the Canadian government. And that's a really laudable goal, but there are some very serious challenges to actually accomplish it. And the sort of piece that I'm going to leave you with on this TRC question, we're going to talk about missing Indigenous women and girls next, but is to understand that part of the issue and part of the reason that this relationship is so hard to remake is that there's a lot of Canadians who fundamentally don't really think it's that important or don't want that. So for example, if you go out and ask, you will find that a majority of Canadians don't think the money being spent in Indigenous affairs is being well spent. They think that a majority of Canadians think that governments are paying too much attention to Indigenous issues, and a majority of Canadians still think that Indigenous Canadians would be better off assimilating. And in that sort of context, right? Remember we were talking about infrastructure funding and the fact that Canadian voters don't hold the federal government accountable for what's happening in Indigenous communities? That's kind of the reason why. There's a perception among a lot of non-Indigenous Canadians that the money spent to resolve Indigenous issues is not useful. That what it's doing is sort of just allowing people to be lazy and drunk and homeless. And yes, that's a horrible thing to say, but that is what a lot of Canadians genuinely think. And that there's this idea that we should be paying less attention to Indigenous issues and that Indigenous issues are secondary to things like the economy, to things like jobs, to things like that kind of piece. And there's still this undercurrent of ethnocentrism, right? Where a majority of Canadians think that the solution here is to assimilate Indigenous people and that they need to sort of leave their cultures behind. And that is in the class of things, right? Like the resistance from the Canadian population is among the class of things that the TRC didn't even get to examine because it's out of scope of their project. right? They're just looking at residential schools. They can't talk about this sort of overarching experience of discrimination.